A sword in a stone proves a king, but what if that famous moment never actually happened? The legend of King Arthur is one of our most enduring stories, a tale of chivalry, magic, and a glorious kingdom called Camelot. Yet behind this magnificent myth lies a shadowy and far more ancient truth. By the end of this journey, you will know the real warriors and battles that forged this immortal king. We will sift through crumbling manuscripts and archaeological finds to uncover a lost age of chaos and war. Was Arthur a Roman commander, a British warlord, or a title worn by many? What forgotten world gave birth to such a powerful dream of a once and future king? The Roman legions were gone. For centuries, they had been the iron spine of Britain, but by the early 5th century, that spine was broken. The empire, buckling under its own weight, recalled its soldiers to defend its heart. What they left behind was not a nation, but a ghost. Abandoned villas crumbled back into the earth. Straight Roman roads, once bustling with trade and messengers, fell silent or became routes for raiders. The complex systems of administration, taxation, and defense simply evaporated. Into this silence crept a new sound, the creak of longships beaching on eastern shores. These were the Saxons, and their arrival plunged Britain into a period so shadowy we still call it the Dark Ages. This is the world where the legend of Arthur was born, not in a shining castle, but in the smoke and chaos of a dying era. Imagine a land fractured into dozens of tiny kingdoms, each ruled by a local warlord vying for control. The old Roman cities, built for a different way of life, were often deserted, their stone skeletons looming over small, struggling communities. The common people, the Britons, clung to the hills and fortified old hill forts, their lives a constant balance between farming and fear. They were a Celtic people, their culture a tapestry of old gods and a new, spreading Christianity, and they were under relentless pressure. The Saxon invaders pushed westward year after year, seizing land and establishing their own settlements. This was not a single great war, but a slow, grinding conflict of ambushes, burned villages, and shifting borders. It was a time of heroes because it was a time of utter desperation. The people needed a figure who could unite the squabbling kingdoms, a war leader who could stand against the tide. They needed a man to hold back the darkness. And from that desperate need, the name Arthur first emerged. The name Arthur itself echoes from a much older world. It is not a classic Celtic name like Bran or Caradoc. Instead, its roots seem to reach back to Rome, to the distinguished family name Artorius. A man named Lucius Artorius Castus even served as a military commander in Britain during the Roman occupation, centuries before our legendary king was said to have lived. This historical figure left behind inscriptions that tell us he led Roman legions in the province. So, could the legendary Arthur have begun as a real Roman British commander, a man who inherited the proud name Artorius? Imagine the scene after the legions departed. Not every Roman citizen left. Many military families had been in Britain for generations. They were born on the island, they married into local families, and they considered it their home. When the empire withdrew, these people did not simply vanish. They were the natural leaders, the ones with generations of military knowledge and organization in their blood. They would have commanded the local militias, the remaining cavalry units, the only semblance of a professional army left. A descendant of such a family, perhaps even named after his famous ancestor Artorius, would have been perfectly positioned to become the war leader the Britons so desperately needed. He would have fought not as a tribal chieftain, but with Roman discipline and tactics, using cavalry in a way that would seem miraculous to his less organized foes. Over generations, as Latin faded and the native Brythonic language evolved, the hard Latin R of Artorius would have softened. Artorius could have easily become Arthur and then, finally, Arthur. This is not just speculation. In the ruins of a Roman fort at Burduswald on Hadrian's Wall, archaeologists found evidence of a great hall built in the post-Roman period, right on top of the old Roman foundations. This suggests a powerful warlord, perhaps from a Roman lineage, was holding the line there long after Rome had fallen, maintaining a bastion of order against the chaos. He was a man living in two worlds, defending a Roman wall with a band of British warriors. So the name Arthur may be more than just a name. It could be a title, a memory, a ghost of Rome haunting the British countryside. Was Arthur the last echo of the empire, a final attempt to bring Roman light to the encroaching Dark Ages? The name Arthur first steps from shadow into written record with a Welsh monk named Nennius. In the early 9th century, some 300 years after the supposed time of Arthur, Nennius compiled a work known as the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons. He did not claim to be writing a fresh history. Instead, he was collecting all the fragments he could find, old poems, monastic records, and oral traditions, weaving them together into a story of his people. And in this patchwork chronicle, we find the first historical mention of a man called Arthur. He is not yet a king crowned in Camelot. He is a war leader, a dux bellorum, who fought alongside the kings of the Britons. And Nennius gives us something incredibly specific, a list of 12 battles. He names them one by one, from a battle at the mouth of a river called Glyne to others in a forest of Celadon and on a hill of Anne. The culmination, the 12th and greatest battle, was at a place called Mount Badon. There, Nennius writes, Arthur single-handedly killed 960 men in one charge. This is a staggering, almost mythical number, but what are we to make of this list? The Historia Brittonum is not a modern history book. It is a document with a clear purpose to glorify the British people and their past heroes in the face of Saxon domination. Nennius was not an impartial observer, he was a storyteller building a national identity. So, did he invent Arthur whole cloth? Or was he recording a genuine tradition, a folk memory of a real military campaign that had been passed down for centuries, growing more legendary with each telling? The battle sites are notoriously difficult to pin on a map. Scholars have debated their locations for generations, with theories placing them from southern Scotland to the west country of England. This very vagueness suggests an ancient origin, a list so old that the specific geography had been lost even to Nennius. He was writing down names that were already centuries old, names that may have come from an old battle poem or a song sung by bards. The Battle of Badon stands out as the most important. Other, earlier sources from the 6th century mention the battle itself as a great victory for the Britons, a victory that halted the Saxon advance for a generation. But those earlier sources do not name the British commander. It is only Nennius, centuries later, who connects the name Arthur to this pivotal historical event. So we are left with a haunting question. Did Nennius attach a famous hero's name to a famous, unnamed victory? Or was he the first to preserve a truth that had been kept alive in the songs of his people? Another crucial document emerges from the shadows, the Annals Cambriae, or the Welsh Annals. This was not a flowing history, but a chronicle, a list of years with brief notes of important events kept by Welsh monks. In the entry for the year 516, it records the Battle of Badon, a victory of Arthur. Then, in the year 537, it notes a much darker event, the strife of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell. And there it is, the first written record of Arthur's final battle and his treacherous nephew, Mordred. This seems like powerful confirmation, a second independent source placing Arthur in a real historical timeline. But we must tread carefully, for these annals are a labyrinth of their own. The manuscript we have today was compiled around the 10th century, but it is believed to be a copy of a much older document, perhaps dating back to the 8th. The problem is that we cannot be certain when the specific entries about Arthur were added. Were they part of the original 8th century compilation, based on even older records, or were they inserted by a later scribe, perhaps one who had read Nennius and wanted to flesh out the timeline? This is the core of the debate. Are these genuine historical records or later interpolations added to give a legendary figure a concrete place in history? The dating itself is also a point of fierce contention. If Arthur truly fell at Camlan in 537, that places his life squarely in the 6th century, a time of intense struggle. Yet other historians argue the original annals used a different method of counting years, which could push the dates for Badon and Camlan back by 20 or even 30 years. This would place Arthur's career earlier in the late 5th century, a time that better fits the archaeological evidence of Saxon expansion. So we are left with a hauntingly sparse record, 2 brief lines in a monastic chronicle that could either be the skeletal truth of a real man or the deliberate planting of a legend into the historical soil. Did a 10th century monk, inspired by tales of a great hero, carefully insert these entries to make the story real, or was he faithfully copying a record that was already 400 years old, a whisper from a time when Arthur was still a memory, not yet a myth? But what if the man we call Arthur was not just a local warlord, but a king who led his armies across the sea? In the year 470, a figure named Riothamus emerges from the historical mist. The name itself is not a personal name, but a title. It means highest king or king of the Britons in the old Brythonic tongue. Here was a man who commanded not just a single tribe, but a force of Britons significant enough to be called upon by the Roman emperor himself. A desperate plea for help came from across the Channel. The Roman territories in Gaul, modern-day France, were under fierce attack by the Visigoths, and so Riothamus, this king of the Britons, sailed from Britain with his army to aid the failing empire. This was not a raid, it was a major expedition, the last known large-scale British military operation on the continent. He fought a campaign in the region of Burgundy, but was eventually betrayed by a Roman official and defeated. The chronicles tell us that after his defeat, Riothamus disappeared. He was last seen fleeing with the remnants of his army into the lands of a friendly tribe known as the Burgundians, and then he simply vanishes from all recorded history. The parallels to the later Arthurian legend are startling. Arthur is the great king who unites Britain. Riothamus holds the title king of the Britons. Arthur fights his final, tragic battle against the traitor Mordred. Riothamus is betrayed by a Roman ally and meets his end in a lost campaign. And most powerfully, in some of the earliest Welsh tales, Arthur does not just stay in Britain. He leads his warriors on great campaigns across the sea, into a mythical otherworld, but perhaps rooted in this very real historical campaign in Gaul. Could the legend of Arthur be the folk memory of Riothamus, a king who left his homeland to fight a doomed war for a dying empire and never returned? His mysterious disappearance would have been a profound trauma for the Britons left behind. A great king, their champion, sails away to a foreign land and is lost. In the absence of a body or a clear account of his death, hope would have festered. The people might have refused to believe he was truly gone, spinning tales that he was merely wounded, that he was taken to a magical isle to heal, and that he would one day return in their hour of greatest need. The story of a once and future king is a story born from a desperate, unanswered question. What happened to our king? Where did he go? A 2nd century Roman memorial stone in Croatia holds a name that echoes through time: Lucius Artorius Castus. This man was no myth. He was a senior officer stationed in Britain, and his story offers one of the most compelling historical foundations for the legend. According to his inscription, Artorius was the prefect of the 6th Legion, and later the commander of a force of Sarmatian cavalry. These Sarmatians were fierce horsemen from the steppes, recruited into the Roman army and posted to the far northern edge of the empire, to Britain. They were a people with their own rich tapestry of myths and rituals, and when their service ended, many settled in Britain, their cultures slowly blending with the local Celtic population. Now consider the stories these Sarmatian warriors would have brought with them. Their most revered object was a sword, thrust point first into the ground upon a small platform, an object of worship and sacrifice. Does that not sound familiar? A powerful blade fixed in the earth, waiting for a rightful leader to draw it forth. The parallel is stunning. Furthermore, their folklore spoke of a magical cup or cauldron possessed by their chief god, a vessel that could grant immortality or resurrection. The quest for a holy grail is a central pillar of the Arthurian cycle, a motif that feels deeply Celtic, yet here it appears in the ancient beliefs of these Eastern horsemen. Could the legend of King Arthur be the magnificent result of a cultural fusion, a story that simmered for centuries in the melting pot of post-Roman Britain? Imagine the descendants of those Sarmatian cavalrymen telling tales of their ancestors' godlike heroes and their sacred sword planted in the earth. Over generations, those stories would have intertwined with Celtic tales of heroic chieftains and their magical treasures. The name of their long-ago Roman commander, Artorius, a name of authority and power, could have easily attached itself to this growing body of folklore. The disciplined Roman leader and the mythic traditions of his steppe warriors merged into a single, idealized figure, a dux bellorum who fought with the strength of 1,000 men and possessed artifacts of divine power. This theory suggests that Arthur was not born from a vacuum, but was forged in the meeting of three worlds: the fading order of Rome, the ancient spirit of Celtic Britain, and the wild legends of the Sarmatian East. The sword in the stone may not have been a test for a boy king, but the distant, distorted memory of a real ritual practiced by foreign horsemen on British soil, a ritual that would one day become the very heart of a king's legitimacy. While the name Arthur echoes from Rome, his spirit roars from the hills of Wales. In the oldest surviving stories of the Britons themselves, we find a figure stripped of the gilded crown of Camelot. This is not King Arthur, but Arthur the Dux Bellorum, the leader of battles. The early Welsh poems and triads, those cryptic lists of traditional lore, paint a picture far darker and more primal than the chivalric romances that would follow centuries later. Here, Arthur is not the ruler of a unified kingdom seated at a round table. He is a paramount warlord, a man who commands the respect and perhaps the fear of the many petty kings of Britain. His power is not derived from a throne, but from his sword and the loyalty of his terrifying warband. These texts show us a world not of courtly love and grand tournaments, but of hard men fighting a desperate, bloody war for survival. The poem known as The Spoils of Annon describes Arthur leading a raid on the Celtic otherworld, a mythical fortress, to steal a magical cauldron. This is not a quest for a holy grail in a Christian sense. This cauldron is a weapon, one that will not boil the food of a coward. It is an artifact of raw, brutal power, and Arthur sails to the land of the dead with his personal troop to seize it. His companions in these early tales are not knights with noble titles. They are figures with supernatural abilities, men who can hear an ant stirring from 100 paces away, or warriors who possess a venomous spear. They are a brotherhood bound by battle, a band of heroes living on the edge of the world, and their leader is the greatest among them. The Welsh triads speak of three great unrests of Britain, one of which was caused when Arthur dragged a rival from a church, violating sanctuary. This is not the act of a pious Christian king. This is the act of a ruthless military commander dealing with a threat by any means necessary. This Arthur is a man of his time, a creature of the Dark Ages, where the line between chief and king, between hero and monster, was terrifyingly thin. He is the general who holds the fractious British kings together through sheer force of will and martial prowess, the only man who can stand against the Saxon tide because he is, himself, as fierce and unforgiving as the enemy he fights. So we must ask which Arthur is closer to the truth. Is it the crowned monarch of a golden age, or is it this battle-hardened Dux Bellorum, a warlord whose legend was forged in the fire and blood of a lost age? A ghost of a castle clings to the windswept cliffs of Cornwall. Tintagel, said to be the legendary birthplace of King Arthur, is a place where myth and stone collide. The ruins that visitors see today are mostly medieval, built by a clever earl hoping to cash in on the growing Arthurian legend. But beneath those later walls lies the true mystery, the archaeological footprint of a far older, far more significant stronghold. Recent excavations have uncovered the remains of a sprawling post-Roman settlement dating from the 5th to the 7th centuries. This was not a village of peasants. The foundations reveal a complex of substantial, well-built stone structures, with fragments of fine pottery and glassware imported from the Mediterranean, from places like Turkey and North Africa. Think about that for a moment. In the so-called Dark Ages, when much of Britain had fractured into isolated communities, the lords of Tintagel were drinking wine from Phoenician jugs and dining on dishes from the Byzantine Empire. This was a place of immense power and wealth, a hub of international trade that defies our image of a barbaric, isolated Britain. Whoever ruled here was no petty chieftain. He was a figure connected to the last vestiges of the Roman economic network, a monarch who commanded ships and traded with what remained of the civilized world. Then, in 1998, a discovery was made that sent a shockwave through the historical community. A stone slate was found, used as a drain cover, bearing a Latin inscription. It reads, "Artagnu, father of a descendant of Coll, has had this built." The name Artagnu is not Arthur, but it is breathtakingly close, a Brythonic name that shares the same root, Arth, meaning bear. This was not a king declaring his greatness on a monument. It was a piece of casual, functional writing, a man claiming credit for a building project that makes it more powerful, more real. Artagnu was a real person of high status, living at Tintagel in the 6th or 7th century, right in the heart of Arthur's supposed era. He was a contemporary of the warlord we have been searching for. So what does this tell us? It tells us that at the very time the legends say a great leader named Arthur united Britain, there was indeed a powerful, sophisticated kingdom in the West, at a place later tradition would call his birthplace. The name Artagnu proves that names similar to Arthur were in use among the ruling class, and the imported goods prove this ruler had the resources and connections to be a major political player. This does not prove that King Arthur was real, but it does prove that his world was real. The legend did not emerge from nothing. It grew from the memory of a time when powerful, Romanized British kings held court in coastal fortresses, living in a style that would have seemed glorious, even magical, to later generations. Tintagel gives us a tangible connection to that lost age of princes, a place where the line between a historical Artagnu and the legendary King Arthur begins to beautifully, tantalizingly blur. The quest for a real Camelot leads us away from the rugged coast of Tintagel and into the heart of ancient Britain. If Arthur was a war leader, a dux bellorum, he needed a headquarters, a central place from which to project his power. The shining castle of legend is a medieval fantasy, but the idea of a great fortress is not. One of the most compelling candidates is Cadbury Castle in Somerset. This is not a castle in the traditional sense, but a vast hill fort, its grassy ramparts rising steeply from the surrounding plains. Its defenses are immense, enclosing an area of 18 acres. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, something remarkable happened here. After centuries of abandonment, the old Iron Age ramparts were massively reinforced. A new, formidable timber wall was built atop the earthworks, a wall wide enough for a gangway where sentries could patrol. This was not the work of a local chieftain. This was the project of a powerful ruler, someone who could command the labor of thousands. The archaeology reveals a grand hall at the summit, a place for feasting and planning, and evidence of fine metalworking and trade. For a brief time, Cadbury was a center of power and industry, a stronghold fit for a high king. Could this have been the original Camelot, its wooden palisades gleaming in the sun, a symbol of British resistance? Another powerful contender lies in Wales at Caerleon. The very name means fortress of the legion. This was one of the three great permanent legionary fortresses in Roman Britain, a place of stone barracks, an immense amphitheatre, and bustling civilian settlement. When the legions left, the place was not entirely deserted. The ruins of a Roman city would have remained, their scale and engineering awe-inspiring to the people of the Dark Ages. The great amphitheatre, with its oval earth bank, could easily have been remembered as a round table where a great leader gathered his warriors. The Welsh bards in their earliest tales frequently associate Arthur with Caerleon, not as a king in a castle, but as a commander using a former Roman stronghold as his base. This fits perfectly with the image of Arthur as a Roman-style dux bellorum, a man inhabiting the ghost of empire. He would have been drawn to a place like Caerleon, its strategic location and imposing ruins a ready-made symbol of the order he sought to restore. Then there is Winchester, a city that later tradition fiercely championed as Arthur's capital. In the great hall of Winchester Castle, a curious object hangs on the wall, a massive round table of wood painted with the image of a king and the names of his knights. Scientific dating, however, reveals the truth. This table was constructed in the 13th century during the reign of Edward I, a monarch deeply enamored with the Arthurian legend. He used the story as a powerful piece of political propaganda, linking his own rule to that of the mythical king. The Winchester table is not a historical artifact from Arthur's time, but a symbol of how the legend was co-opted and reshaped for a new era. It shows us that the search for Camelot is not just about archaeology, it is about the human need to pin a glorious story to a real place on the map. So we are left with a choice between a refortified hill fort humming with industry, a decaying Roman fortress echoing with past glories, and a medieval city that rewrote history to claim the legend for itself. Perhaps the real Camelot was not a single location but an idea, a memory of a time when a powerful leader could unite the land from any one of these mighty strongholds. The Battle of Mount Badon stands as the great defining victory of the Arthurian age, a moment where the Saxon flood was finally and decisively turned back. For decades, the Germanic tribes had pushed relentlessly inland from their coastal enclaves, their advance a slow burn of settlement and conquest. Badon was the British counterstroke, a battle so successful that it granted the native Britons 2 generations of peace, a breathing space where their culture and language could solidify in the West, in the lands we now call Wales and Cornwall. But the battlefield itself is a ghost, its location one of history's most stubborn cold cases. Was it the ancient hill fort of Badbury Rings in Dorset, its concentric earthworks a natural fortress? Or was it at Bath, beneath the looming Salisbury Hill, where the old Roman road provided a strategic corridor? Perhaps it was further north, near the Roman town of Chester. Each theory places the conflict in a different British kingdom, suggesting that Arthur's authority, if he existed, stretched across a fractured land. The tactics used would have been a blend of old and new. The British forces, likely a coalition from several kingdoms, would have fought in a style inherited from Rome. They may have been a combined arms force where a corps of disciplined infantry, armed with long spears and large shields, formed a solid battle line. Their true advantage, however, may have been their cavalry. The descendants of Roman horsemen and Sarmatian auxiliaries would have provided a mobile strike force that the Saxons, who primarily fought on foot, could not easily match. Imagine the scene from the Saxon perspective. Their shield wall, a formidable and experienced formation, advances up a steep slope towards a fortified British position. They are confident, having won many such engagements before. Then, from the flanks comes the thunder of hooves, armored riders, a sight both terrifying and alien, smash into the sides of their formation, breaking its cohesion. At that moment, the British infantry charge downhill. The Saxon advance shatters into a bloody rout. This is the charge where Nennius claims Arthur single-handedly slew 960 men. While that number is a poetic exaggeration, it captures the sheer, overwhelming scale of the victory. The symbolic importance of Badon cannot be overstated. It was not just a military win, it was a cultural salvation. For the Britons, it proved they could still win, that their gods or their god had not abandoned them. It preserved a Celtic, Christian world in the West for centuries to come, allowing the traditions and stories that would eventually birth the Arthurian legend to survive and flourish. Without Badon, the name Arthur might have been lost to history, just another forgotten chieftain in a lost war. Instead, this victory ensured his story would be told for 1,000 years, the moment a man held the line and became a myth. But every victory, no matter how glorious, casts a long shadow. The peace Arthur won at Mount Badon could not last forever. The legend tells us that in his final days, the king was betrayed by his own kin, his nephew Mordred, leading to a cataclysmic civil war that shattered the dream of a united Britain. This is the Battle of Camlan, the fatal conflict that ended the Age of Heroes. While the Welsh annals record it simply as the strife of Camlan, where both Arthur and Medrawd fell, the later romances weave a more elaborate tragedy of a kingdom torn apart from within. Arthur returns from a campaign to find Mordred has seized his throne and queen. The resulting battle is not against a foreign invader, but against his own people, a bitter and bloody fratricide that leaves the land stained and leaderless. This theme of internal betrayal feels painfully real for the period. The post-Roman British kingdoms were not a unified nation. They were a collection of rival factions and ambitious warlords constantly jockeying for power. A high king like Arthur would have ruled through a fragile web of alliances and forced loyalties. It would have taken only one powerful, disgruntled subordinate, perhaps a man named Medrawd, to shatter that web. The historical inspiration for Camlan could very well have been a real, devastating civil war between British factions, a conflict so traumatic that it was remembered for centuries as the event that broke their last best hope. The search for the battlefield is as elusive as the search for Camelot itself. One tradition places it at the River Camel in Cornwall, where the slaying of a local chieftain in a petty war could have been magnified over time into a legendary showdown. Another theory points to the Roman fort of Cambaglana on Hadrian's Wall, a lonely, windswept outpost whose name sounds strikingly similar to Camlan. Could the final battle have been a desperate struggle to hold the northern frontier, a last stand against a rebel force that ended with the death of the last great commander? There are sites in Wales and even Scotland that also claim the honor. This geographical confusion is itself a clue. The story of a great internal collapse was so powerful that many communities, witnessing their own local conflicts and the ruins of old fortifications, may have seen their own history reflected in the legend. Camlan represents more than just the death of a man. It marks the end of an era. With Arthur gone, the chronicles suggest the fragile coalition of British kings fell apart. The temporary peace secured at Badon evaporated, and the Saxon advance, paused for a generation, resumed with renewed force. The dream of a restored, united Britain died on that mythical battlefield. The world that followed was darker, more fractured, and the memory of the great war leader who once held the line faded into song and story. The man became a myth because the world he fought for was truly lost, leaving only a haunting question. Did the Britons, in their darkest hour, turn on the very hero who had saved them? That legendary sword in the stone is not the whole story. The weapon we know as Excalibur began its life with a much older, more brutal name. In the earliest Welsh tales, Arthur's blade is called Caled Fulch, a name that translates to hard cleft or hard gap. This is not a name of elegance or magic, it is a description of pure, destructive function. It is the sword that cleaves armor, shields, and helmets, a tool of war for a war leader. This Celtic origin point is crucial, grounding the weapon in a world of iron and blood before it was polished by later romance. The journey from this hard Welsh name to the shimmering Excalibur is a map of the legend's own evolution. When the story traveled to the continent and was written down by clerics who used Latin, Calad was Latinized to Caliburnus. This shift was more than just a change in spelling. It was a step towards a more classical, Roman-inflected hero. The hard Celtic sounds were smoothed into the scholarly language of the educated, beginning the sword's transformation from a warrior's tool into a symbol of imperial authority. Then, in the French courts of the 12th century, the legend underwent its most dramatic change. The troubadours and poets, like Chrétien de Troyes, were crafting tales of chivalry and courtly love for a noble audience. In their hands, the harsh Latin Caliburnus was polished and refined, becoming the beautiful, melodic Excalibur. The sword now matched the glittering court of Camelot they were inventing, a world far removed from the Dark Age hill forts of the original tales. But here is where the story fractures in a fascinating way. The popular myth conflates two very different swords. One is the sword in the stone, the test of kingship that proves Arthur's divine right to rule by pulling the blade from an anvil on a stone. This is a test of lineage and legitimacy. The other is the sword Excalibur, given to Arthur by the mystical Lady of the Lake after he broke the first sword in a fight. This second blade, with its unbreakable quality and its magical scabbard that prevents its wearer from losing blood, is a gift of supernatural power. Why would a legend need two swords? The answer lies in the layers of the story. The sword in the stone is a political symbol. It is about a rightful heir, a chosen one selected by a miracle to end a period of chaos and dispute. It speaks to a deep human desire for a leader whose authority is beyond question, ordained by God or destiny. The Lady of the Lake's gift, however, is a marker of a different kind of power. It represents Arthur's connection to the ancient, primal forces of the land itself, to the old Celtic otherworld that existed long before kings and crowns. The scabbard is even more important than the blade, for it represents not the ability to deal death, but the power to preserve life. A king who cannot be wounded in battle is a truly invincible ruler. Ultimately, both swords serve the same profound purpose: to legitimize Arthur's rule. One does it through the divine right of kings, a concept that would become central to medieval monarchy. The other does it through the raw, magical power of the old world. The evolution of the sword from the brutal Calad to the enchanted Excalibur mirrors the journey of Arthur himself, from a historical war leader to a mythical once and future king. His authority had to be rooted in both the stone of the church and the water of the ancient gods. Yet every great king needs a counselor, a source of wisdom and power beyond the sword. The wizard Merlin is as iconic as Arthur himself, but his origins are even stranger and more fragmented. He was not born a single, coherent character. Instead, he is a magical fusion of two very different figures from the deep past. The first is Myrddin Wyllt, a name that echoes from the oldest Welsh poetry. This Myrddin was no courtly magician. He was a wild man of the forest, a warrior who fought in a terrible battle and witnessed such horrific slaughter that his mind shattered. He fled into the Caledonian forest, living among the beasts, surviving on roots and berries. In his madness, he was said to have gained the gift of prophecy, his ravings containing glimpses of the future. This is a figure rooted in the primal terror of war, a man broken by the very conflict he once participated in. The second figure is one we have already met, Ambrosius Aurelianus, the possible historical war leader. In the early chronicles, it is Ambrosius, not Merlin, who is the wise prophet and strategist advising the British kings. He is the one with the vision and foresight to guide the war effort. So how did these two, the mad prophet of the wood and the sober Roman British leader, become one? The answer lies with a 12th century cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his immensely popular History of the Kings of Britain, Geoffrey performed a literary alchemy. He took the name Myrddin, but found it too close to the French word for dung, merde. So he softened it, creating the name Merlinus or Merlin. Then he stripped away the wild man's madness and merged his prophetic gifts with the authority and political role of Ambrosius. In Geoffrey's hands, Merlin became the architect of Arthur's birth, the engineer of the sword in the stone, and the mystical advisor to the throne. He was no longer a traumatized survivor babbling in the woods, but a calculated, powerful sorcerer shaping the destiny of a nation. This fusion connected the new character to two powerful traditions. His prophetic side reached back to the ancient Celtic seers and druids, men who were believed to communicate with the spirit of the land itself. His political role as a kingmaker reflected a medieval world where bishops and holy men were often the power behind the throne. Merlin became the bridge between the old, wild magic of Britain and the new, structured order of the kingdom Arthur was destined to build. He is the embodiment of the land's deep memory, a memory that holds both the sanity of Rome and the beautiful, terrifying madness of the ancient forests. The queen we know as Guinevere was not always a figure of tragic romance. In the earliest Welsh tales, Arthur's wife appears under the name Gwenhwyfar, a name meaning white spirit or white phantom. She is a shadowy presence defined not by love, but by a single, catastrophic event recorded in a triad of Welsh literature. The text states bluntly that one of the three great blows that shattered the kingdom was a blow struck by Gwenhwyfar, which caused the Battle of Camlan. This is a far cry from an illicit affair. This paints the queen as an active, perhaps even violent, participant in the political collapse of Arthur's realm. Was she striking a rival, or was this a metaphorical blow, a decision or an act of betrayal that set brother against brother? The early sources offer no details, only the stark accusation that the queen herself helped bring down the Golden Age. This foundational layer presents a queen of consequence, a woman whose actions had the power to unravel empires. It is a story rooted in the harsh realities of dynastic politics and tribal conflict, where a queen was a key piece in the fragile alliance between kingdoms. Her marriage to Arthur would have been a political union binding two powerful families or regions together. In this light, any strife between them would not have been a private matter of the heart but a national crisis. The original Gwenhwyfar was likely a figure of immense political importance, and her story was one of catastrophic fallout, not forbidden passion. Then, in the lavish courts of 12th century France, her entire character was reinvented. A poet named Chrétien de Troyes, writing for the sophisticated Countess Marie of Champagne, introduced a new and revolutionary concept, courtly love. In this code of conduct, a knight would pledge his undying devotion and service to a noble lady, often one who was married to his lord. This love was meant to be an unattainable spiritual pursuit that refined the knight's character and inspired his great deeds. It was a literary game for an aristocratic audience, far removed from the muddy battlefields of post-Roman Britain. Chrétien needed a central love triangle to showcase this new ideal, and he found his players in the Arthurian legend. He took the shadowy Welsh queen and the nearly non-existent character of Lancelot, and he wove them into a devastating drama. In his romance, Lancelot becomes the perfect courtly lover, performing incredible feats of arms solely for the love of Queen Guinevere. His every action is dedicated to her. Their secret, forbidden love becomes the engine of the story, a thrilling tension between personal desire and public duty. This transformation shifted the entire axis of the legend. Arthur was no longer just a war leader, he became a cuckolded husband. The central conflict was no longer Britons versus Saxons, but the internal struggle between love and loyalty. The ultimate tragedy of Camelot was no longer a simple political betrayal, but a deeply personal one, where the king's best friend and his wife are the architects of his downfall. This was a story that resonated deeply with a medieval aristocratic audience, for whom marriage was often a political arrangement and romantic love existed outside of it. The French romancers gave the legend a new, human heart, but in doing so, they buried the older, more politically charged truth of the queen. the character of Lancelot himself is perhaps the greatest invention of this period. He is barely a ghost in the earliest Celtic myths. Some scholars argue he may be a faint memory of a Welsh hero named Llwch Lenliwg, but the figure we know is almost entirely a French creation. Chrétien de Troyes, in his poem Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, establishes him as the paramount knight, the model of chivalry, whose one fatal flaw is his all-consuming love for the queen. Later French prose cycles would expand his backstory, giving him a mystical upbringing by the Lady of the Lake and establishing him as the greatest knight in the world, whose very perfection makes his betrayal of Arthur all the more tragic. So we are left with two very different queens and two very different stories. One is Gwenhwyfar, whose actions helped trigger a civil war. The other is Guinevere, the beautiful, trapped queen whose heart leads to the kingdom's ruin. One story is about power and its consequences, the other about love and its costs. This duality lies at the very core of the Arthurian legend, a reminder that our myths are not fixed in stone, but are living stories, constantly reshaped to reflect the dreams and fears of every new generation that tells them. The Round Table is a perfect symbol of equality, but it was an invention of a later, more romantic age. In the glittering courts of 12th century Normandy and France, poets like Wace and Chrétien de Troyes introduced the world to a fellowship of noble knights, all seated as equals around a circular table. There was no head, no foot, no place of higher honor. This was a powerful fantasy of perfect chivalric brotherhood, a world where knights were bound by codes of honor, courtly love, and sacred quests. It was a vision designed to flatter and inspire a new aristocratic class, one that valued elaborate manners and the art of romance as much as the art of war. This idealized brotherhood is a far cry from the gritty reality of Arthur's original war band. To understand the men who truly fought for him, we must look not to the French romances, but to the old Welsh institution known as the Tulu. This was not a table of equals, but a lord's personal household troop, a band of warriors bound by a far more primal and practical loyalty. The Tulu, meaning family in the broadest sense, was a military unit built for survival. Its members were often the sons of noble families, sent to serve in the household of a powerful warlord to learn the arts of war and politics. They were fed, housed, and equipped by their lord, and in return they offered him their absolute loyalty unto death. Their bond was not one of polite equality, but of a fierce hierarchical devotion. The lord was the provider, the ring giver, and the men were his hands, his swords. Their lives were not spent on quests for holy relics, but on cattle raids, ambushes, and the brutal, close-quarters work of shield wall combat. The spoils of war were not spiritual rewards, but tangible wealth, land, and prestige. This was a world where a warrior's worth was measured by the number of enemies he could put to the sword and the treasure he could bring back to his chieftain. The contrast between these two brotherhoods could not be more stark. The French Round Table represents an ideal, a dream of a civilized and ordered society where conflict is governed by rules and dedicated to higher purposes. The Welsh Tulu represents the harsh necessity of a world where survival was the only code and victory was the only virtue. One was built for the pageantry of the castle hall, the other for the mud and blood of the Dark Age battlefield. So when we picture Arthur's knights, we must hold both images in our mind. The shining, equal fellowship is a beautiful later fiction, a coat of medieval paint applied to a much older, rougher timber. But that original timber, the loyal, ruthless Tulu, was the true foundation. It was from this brutal, practical warband that the legend grew, its rough edges slowly sanded away and gilded by centuries of storytellers who dreamed of a more perfect, more chivalrous past. The quest for the Holy Grail feels like the very heart of the Arthurian legend, a search for divine purity. Yet this most Christian of relics began its life as something entirely different, a powerful object from the pagan Celtic world. Long before it was a sacred chalice, it was a magical cauldron. In Welsh mythology, the god known as the Dagda possessed a cauldron of plenty that could never be emptied, ensuring no hero would ever go hungry. Other Celtic tales speak of the cauldron of the head of Bran, a vessel that could restore the dead to life, though the resurrected would be forever silent. And we have already seen Arthur himself in the earliest Welsh poems, leading a raid on the otherworldly fortress of Annwn to seize a cauldron that would not boil the food of a coward. These cauldrons were not symbols of grace, they were tools of raw, primal power, offering immortality, sustenance, and a test of warrior courage. They were central to a worldview where magic was woven into the very fabric of the land, and the greatest treasures were those that cheated death itself. So how did this pagan pot become the cup of Christ? The transformation was a deliberate act of cultural rebranding, one of the most successful in literary history. As Christianity solidified its hold over Britain and Europe, the old stories had to be made acceptable, even pious. The magical properties of the cauldron, its ability to give life and endless nourishment, were too powerful to simply discard. Instead, they were repurposed. The life-giving cauldron became the life-giving chalice, the vessel that held the blood of Christ, which promised eternal salvation. This was not an accident. It was the work of monastic writers, particularly the Cistercian monks of the 12th and 13th centuries. This order emphasized a pure, austere, and deeply spiritual form of Christianity, and they saw in the Grail quest a perfect metaphor for the soul's arduous journey toward God. In their hands, the Grail became a symbol of divine grace, something that could only be perceived by a knight of perfect purity like Galahad. The worldly fellowship of the Round Table was reframed as a spiritual brotherhood on a collective pilgrimage. Then a German poet named Wolfram von Eschenbach took this transformation even further. In his epic Parzival, written in the early 13th century, the Grail is not even a cup. It is a stone, the lapis exilis, fallen from heaven. It provides endless food and eternal youth, and it is guarded by an order of sacred knights. Wolfram's version is a fascinating hybrid, blending Christian theology with alchemical symbolism and Eastern legends he may have encountered. His Grail is a physical object with immense power, yet its true meaning is entirely spiritual, a test of compassion and faith for the hero Parzival. The journey from the Celtic cauldron to the Christian chalice is the story of a myth adapting to survive. The ancient, magical soul of Britain was not destroyed by the new religion. It was baptized and given a new name. The deep human yearning for a source of ultimate life and healing simply found a new vessel, proving that the oldest magic never truly dies. It just changes its shape to speak to a new world. A single book transformed the fractured warrior of the Britons into an emperor. In the year 1136, a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published his Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain. This was not a dry historical record. It was a work of breathtaking ambition, a chronicle that claimed to trace the lineage of the British kings all the way back to the fall of Troy. And at the heart of this grand tapestry, he placed a figure more magnificent than any before him, King Arthur. Geoffrey did not just record a legend, he built it from the ground up. He took the shadowy dux bellorum from the Welsh annals and gave him a crown, a court, and a global empire. In Geoffrey's pages, Arthur is no longer just a war leader who won a few battles in Britain. He is a conqueror who subdues Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, and Norway. He crosses the Channel and defeats the legions of Rome itself in a spectacular Gallic campaign. This Arthur is a monarch of unparalleled power and splendor, a figure designed to rival the great heroes of classical antiquity. Geoffrey also gave Arthur his supporting cast. He introduced the world to the wise magician Merlin, blending the wild man Myrddin with the statesman Ambrosius. He gave us the beautiful Queen Guinevere and the treacherous Mordred. He described the king's court at Caerleon in lavish detail, planting the seed for the later concept of Camelot. He even provided the first full account of Arthur's final battle, and his mysterious departure to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds. Where did Geoffrey get all this? He claimed rather conveniently that he was translating a very ancient book in the British tongue, a source no one else has ever seen. The truth is that he was a masterful storyteller, weaving together scraps of Welsh folklore, snippets of Nennius, his own vivid imagination, and a heavy dose of political propaganda. His work was an instant runaway success. It was copied and recopied across Europe, captivating kings and commoners alike. But was it history? Other chroniclers of his own time, like William of Malmesbury, were deeply skeptical, dismissing his tales as obvious fictions. Yet the public did not care. Geoffrey had given them a hero for the ages, a British king whose glory could stand beside Charlemagne or Alexander the Great. His book provided a glorious, fictional past for a nation that often felt overshadowed by the Normans and the French. He created a national myth of such power and appeal that it refused to be confined to the page. The Historia Regum Britanniae was the rocket that launched the Arthurian legend into the literary stratosphere, providing the core narrative that all the poets and romancers who followed would embellish, adapt, and reinvent for centuries to come. A fire nearly destroyed Glastonbury Abbey in 1184, leaving the monks with a desperate need for funds and a powerful opportunity. 7 years later, they announced an earth-shattering discovery. Deep beneath the abbey grounds, between two ancient stone pyramids, their digging had uncovered a massive hollowed-out oak log. Inside, they claimed, were the bones of a gigantic man, along with a smaller skeleton and a lock of golden hair. A lead cross was found with the burial, its inscription reading, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon." The news was a sensation. The greatest British hero, the once and future king, had not vanished to a magical isle but was buried here at Glastonbury. It was a perfect story, but the timing was deeply suspicious. The discovery came during the reign of King Henry II, a monarch with a very specific political problem. In Wales, the native princes were using the legend of Arthur to fuel rebellion, claiming the great Celtic king would return to lead them against their Norman rulers. The belief in a messianic Arthur was a direct threat to Henry's authority. What better way to shatter that hope than to produce the king's body, to prove he was well and truly dead? The monks at Glastonbury had a powerful incentive to comply. Their abbey needed money for rebuilding, and what could be more lucrative than becoming the premier pilgrimage site for King Arthur himself? The lead cross itself is a masterpiece of forgery. Its Latin inscription used a style of lettering that was common in the 11th century, not the 6th century when Arthur supposedly died. A forger living in the 1190s would have seen 11th century script on old documents and naturally copied it, not realizing it was still anachronistic by 500 years. The description of the gigantic skeleton also fits a pattern of medieval relic fraud, where the bones of biblical giants or legendary heroes were always improbably large, adding to their perceived authenticity. Modern archaeology has confirmed the monk's story does not hold up. Excavations at Glastonbury have found no evidence of the grand burial they described, no trace of the stone pyramids, and no physical proof of the hollowed oak log coffin. The lead cross itself was last seen in the 18th century and is now lost, surviving only in drawings. Most scholars now agree the entire event was an elaborate and brilliantly conceived hoax, a public relations stunt designed to generate revenue and political favor. It was a fraud that worked for centuries, permanently cementing Glastonbury's place in the Arthurian mythos. This monastic deception reveals a profound truth about the legend. Arthur's power was so immense that even his proven death could be a valuable commodity. The monks of Glastonbury did not just find a king, they invented a tomb, understanding that the end of the story could be just as potent as the beginning. The legend did not fade with the monks of Glastonbury. It slept, waiting for a new voice to awaken it for a new age. That voice belonged to a man of deeply flawed character, Sir Thomas Malory. While imprisoned for a litany of crimes including robbery, extortion, and violent assault, Malory compiled and translated the vast French romances into a single, powerful English epic, Le Morte d'Arthur. Completed around 1470, his work was one of the first books printed in England by William Caxton. Malory took the sprawling, complex tales of chivalry and distilled them into a cohesive and tragic narrative, from Arthur's miraculous birth to his final voyage to Avalon. He gave us the definitive version of the Round Table Oath, a code of chivalry that would echo for centuries. He perfected the love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, and he framed the entire story as a grand moral tragedy, the rise and fall of a perfect kingdom brought low by human frailty. Malory's Arthur was not Geoffrey of Monmouth's imperial conqueror, but a noble, almost doomed figure, a king whose greatest achievement contained the seeds of its own destruction. This was the version that would cement the legend in the English-speaking consciousness, a story written in a prison cell that would define the ideals of knightly honor for generations. After Malory, the legend entered a period of quiet. The rationalism of the Enlightenment had little patience for tales of magic and chivalry. But in the turbulent 19th century, a different kind of magic was stirring. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the world, creating a sense of dislocation and a deep nostalgia for a simpler, more heroic past. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson answered this longing with his Idylls of the King. Published over several decades, Tennyson's cycle of poems transformed the medieval legend into a profound Victorian allegory. His Camelot is a shining bastion of duty and moral order, threatened not just by external evil, but by the internal corrosion of sin and doubt. Arthur becomes a symbol of pure, almost impossible idealism, a leader striving to build a perfect society in a fallen world. The adulterous love of Lancelot and Guinevere is not just a personal betrayal, but a crack in the very foundation of this society, a failure of the moral code that leads to its inevitable collapse. Tennyson's work resonated deeply with a society grappling with rapid change, religious uncertainty, and strict social codes. He used the ancient story to explore the very Victorian anxieties about faith, progress, and the sanctity of the home. Then came the 20th century, and with it, a new medium of myth-making. Cinema took the legend and reshaped it for the modern world. Each film reflected the era of its creation. The 1967 musical Camelot, released at the height of the Cold War and social unrest, presented a fragile, beautiful kingdom as a metaphor for the American ideal, a brief, shining moment that was passing away. John Boorman's 1981 film Excalibur presented a darker, more primal and mystical version, steeped in the relationship between the king and the land, a tale of magic and fate that felt more ancient and Celtic. More recent adaptations continue this pattern of reinvention. They hold up a mirror to our own time. A film like King Arthur from 2004 stripped away the magic almost entirely, presenting Arthur as a Roman cavalry officer, a gritty historical soldier for an audience fascinated with realism. The television series Merlin reframed the story for a younger generation, focusing on the friendship and coming of age of the wizard and the future king. Every generation finds its own Arthur. We see in him what we need to see, a symbol of lost unity, of moral certainty, or of the struggle to build a just society against overwhelming odds. The legend is a vessel endlessly refillable with our own contemporary hopes and fears. The sword in the stone is always waiting for someone to draw it, and the story of Camelot is always ready to be told again because its central question is timeless. Can we, flawed as we are, ever build a perfect world? And if we could, what would it cost us to keep it? The power of Arthur's story lies not in its historical truth, but in its emotional one. It is a legend perfectly engineered to answer some of our deepest human fears and longings. At its core is the potent promise of the once and future king, a ruler who does not truly die but sleeps, waiting to return in his country's darkest hour. This is not just a comforting fairy tale. In times of genuine crisis, when invaders threaten or society seems to crumble, this myth offers a profound hope, a belief that a savior is not gone forever, but is merely waiting in the shadows, ready to restore order and justice. It transforms history from a random sequence of events into a story with a destined, hopeful ending. We see this pattern echoed in other myths, from the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sleeping in a mountain to the Irish hero Fionn mac Cumhaill awaiting his recall. These stories are a cultural safety net, a psychological bulwark against despair. This ties directly to our yearning for the ideal ruler, a figure who wields power not for personal gain but for the common good. Arthur, who draws the sword from the stone, is the ultimate meritocrat. His right to rule is not solely inherited, it is earned through a divine test. He is the good king, the one who establishes a code of justice and creates a fellowship where the best and bravest, regardless of their birth, have a seat at the table. In a world so often dominated by corrupt or incompetent leaders, the dream of Arthur is a dream of political perfection. He represents a world where might serves right, where the powerful protect the weak, and where the kingdom is a sacred trust. This ideal resonates across centuries because the desire for a truly just and capable leader is, for most people, a perpetual, unfulfilled wish. Yet the legend is also powerful because it acknowledges that this perfect order is fragile, threatened from within by our own human weaknesses. The devastating love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot is a timeless exploration of the tension between personal desire and public duty. Here is the great king, betrayed by his best friend and his wife. His heart is broken, but the greater tragedy is the collapse of his life's work. The personal failing becomes a political catastrophe. This story forces us to ask a difficult question. Can any of us, no matter how noble our intentions, ever fully subordinate our private passions to the demands of our public roles? The fall of Camelot suggests that the dream of a perfect society may be shattered by the very people who built it, that the seeds of destruction are sown in the human heart. Ultimately, Arthur's world represents a lost golden age, a brief, shining moment of peace and harmony that we can never quite recapture. Every culture has its own version of this, a nostalgic memory of a better time before things fell apart. Camelot is that for the British Isles, but also for the wider world. It is a symbol of a unity that was fractured, a greatness that was achieved and then lost. We are forever looking back to it, not just as a historical period, but as a psychological state, a time when things were as they should be. The enduring quest for the historical Arthur is in many ways a search for this lost paradise, an attempt to prove that such a perfect time and place once actually existed. We keep telling the story because we need to believe that perfection, however fleeting, is possible. The legend endures because it is built from the fundamental building blocks of our own hopes and fears, a dream of a king who was, and a promise that he might one day be again. The search for Arthur has moved from dusty manuscripts to the very soil of Britain itself. Modern archaeologists no longer just dig with shovels, they see with X-ray vision. Sophisticated tools like ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR are mapping the landscape in astonishing detail, revealing lost cities and fortifications invisible to the naked eye. LiDAR works by firing laser pulses from an aircraft, stripping away the dense canopy of forests to map the ground beneath. This technology has uncovered a breathtaking network of ancient roads and settlements from the post-Roman period, proving this was not an empty land descending into chaos, but a complex society reorganizing itself. At the famous hill fort of South Cadbury, long linked to Camelot, these surveys have detected the outlines of a massive timber hall and numerous smaller buildings, confirming it was a major power center. While no plaque bears Arthur's name, the scale of these structures tells us a powerful ruler did command from this place, a leader capable of marshalling the resources to build a stronghold worthy of a high king. Even the science of dirt is telling a new story. soil core analysis and precise radiocarbon dating are allowing us to reconstruct the environment of the 5th and 6th centuries with incredible accuracy. We can now see the pollen grains of specific crops, showing where and when farming intensified or collapsed. We can find the microscopic remains of beetles that lived in stored grain, telling us about a settlement's wealth and food security. This environmental evidence paints a picture of a resilient Britain. In the West, at sites like Tintagel, the land was still productive, supporting the elite who traded for Mediterranean wine. In the East, the story is different, with signs of Saxon settlement patterns appearing alongside evidence of violent conflict. This scientific data does not give us a single king, but it gives us his world, a patchwork of thriving British kingdoms and encroaching Saxon communities, a land in flux where a great war leader was not just possible but necessary. The most personal evidence comes from the bones of the people who lived and died in this era. DNA analysis of skeletons from post-Roman cemeteries is rewriting our understanding of the Saxon migration itself. It was not a simple case of invaders wiping out the natives. The genetic story is one of slow integration, of intermarriage and cultural mixing over generations. In some graves, we find a person buried with classic British artifacts, yet their DNA shows strong Saxon ancestry. In others, we see the opposite, a skeleton with a Saxon-style brooch, but genetically linked to the local Celtic population. This complex picture suggests that the wars of Arthur were not a clear-cut ethnic conflict, but a messy struggle for power between mixed and shifting factions. The enemy lines were blurred, making the achievement of a leader who could unite the Britons, even temporarily, all the more remarkable. One of the most tantalizing recent discoveries came from a slab of stone at Tintagel. The so-called Artagnu stone, found in the 1990s, caused a sensation with its inscription. But beyond that famous find, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of smaller artifacts that bring the era to life. They have found fine glass from Spain, pottery from North Africa, and intricate metalwork crafted in local workshops. These objects testify to a sophisticated society with international connections. The rulers of these Western kingdoms were not barbaric chieftains huddled in dark huts. They were monarchs participating in a fading but still active Atlantic trade network. They lived in well-built stone structures, they feasted on imported delicacies, and they commanded respect. This is the real world from which the legend of a glorious court like Camelot could plausibly emerge. Archaeology has not found the man, but it has found his stage, proving that the Britain of the 5th and 6th centuries was capable of producing kings whose power and prestige would inspire stories for 1,000 years. The absence of a smoking gun named Arthur is in its own way a powerful clue, pointing not to a single monarch, but to an age of many powerful leaders, one of whom became the vessel for all their stories. So we are left with several compelling figures, each of whom could be the seed from which the legendary king grew. The most prominent theory points to a Romanized British warlord, a man like Ambrosius Aurelianus, whom the chronicler Gildas praised as a leader of the last generation. He would have been precisely the kind of figure to rally the crumbling British kingdoms, a man of Roman heritage fighting with disciplined tactics to preserve a fading world. His story provides the perfect historical skeleton for a Dux Bellorum, a war leader holding back the Saxon advance. Yet the chronicles never call him Arthur, leaving a tantalizing gap between this likely historical figure and the legendary name. Then there is the ghost of the North, the 2nd century Roman commander Lucius Artorius Castus. His name is a perfect match, and his command of Sarmatian cavalry offers a plausible origin for the knightly themes and the iconic sword in the stone. This theory suggests the legend is a cultural fusion, a story that simmered for centuries as the tales of this Roman officer and the myths of his eastern horsemen blended with Celtic heroism. The strength here is the linguistic link and the fascinating cultural parallels, but the weakness is a vast chronological gap, separating this Roman officer from the battles of the 5th and 6th centuries by over 200 years. Could a name and a legend truly lie dormant for so long before blooming? The king who crossed the sea, Riothamus, presents a different kind of candidate. His title means highest king, and his story is a mirror of Arthur's later tragedy. He led a British army to Gaul, was betrayed, and vanished after a final battle. This historical narrative fits the pattern of a great king meeting his end through treachery and disappearing, fostering the myth of a once and future king. The appeal is the powerful story arc, but the connection is thematic rather than direct. No source calls Riothamus Arthur, and his campaign was on the continent, far from the traditional British battlefields. Faced with these imperfect but plausible figures, many scholars now argue that Arthur was never one man at all. He may have been a title, a role filled by several successful war leaders over generations, whose combined victories were later remembered as the deeds of a single superhuman hero. Or he could be a composite, a literary figure crafted from the best stories of multiple champions. The name itself could be a powerful brand, a banner under which later writers gathered all the hopes and victories of a desperate age. This composite theory elegantly explains why no single candidate perfectly fits, and why the legend contains so many contradictory details and locations. It suggests that Arthur is not a person to be found, but an era to be understood, the embodiment of British resistance in a lost century. The truth may be that the real King Arthur was all of these men, and none of them, a dream built from the bones of many forgotten heroes. A king who may never have existed became the most powerful political tool in British history. The Norman conquerors who seized England in 1066 faced a problem. They were a foreign dynasty ruling a defeated population. To legitimize their power, they reached for the most potent native myth they could find. The Plantagenet King Edward I, a ruthless and ambitious ruler, became utterly fascinated with the Arthurian legend. He staged great round-table tournaments where his knights would joust and feast in imitation of Arthur's court. During a campaign to subdue Wales, he even went so far as to parade what he claimed were the crown of Arthur before the Welsh chieftains. This was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, a way of saying that the true heir to the British heroic past was not a Welsh prince, but the English king sitting in London. He was using their own national hero against them, appropriating Arthur's symbolic power to justify his own imperial rule. This was not about historical truth, it was a calculated political performance, and it proved incredibly effective. The legend was a crown that could be stolen and worn by any ruler bold enough to claim it. Later, the Tudors performed an even more brilliant act of political alchemy. Henry VII, who seized the throne in 1485 after a long civil war, traced his own Welsh ancestry. He named his firstborn son Arthur, a deliberate and powerful signal that his new dynasty was the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy, the return of the British king in the form of a Welsh-descended monarch. The message was clear: the long-lost Arthur had finally returned, and his name was Tudor. Prince Arthur's untimely death was a tragedy, but the symbolic link was already forged in the public mind. His brother, who became the infamous Henry VIII, continued to exploit the connection, filling his court with Arthurian imagery and using the legend to bolster his own claim to imperial authority, free from the interference of the Pope in Rome. Yet even as the English monarchy co-opted the legend, the original Celtic peoples, particularly the Welsh, never surrendered their hero. For centuries, the Welsh bards kept the old stories alive, singing of Arthur not as a king of England, but as a champion of the Britons, the very people the English had pushed into the Western Mountains. The belief that Arthur would one day return to lead his people to victory became a potent form of cultural resistance. During times of rebellion, Welsh leaders would invoke his name, promising that the once and future king was sleeping, not dead, and would awaken to restore their sovereignty. This was more than folklore, it was a political statement, a declaration that the English rule was temporary and that a true British king would one day reclaim his throne. This enduring hope made Arthur so dangerous that an English king felt compelled to dig him up at Glastonbury to prove he was truly gone. The figure of Arthur thus became a battlefield for the soul of Britain itself, claimed by both conqueror and conquered. His legend provided a blueprint for kingship, a font of legitimacy for incoming dynasties, and a symbol of defiant hope for the displaced. A possibly fictional warrior became the single most important figure in the long and turbulent story of British national identity, a ghost who shaped the destiny of a nation. The search for a single king ends not with a discovery but with a revelation. We have sifted through the dust of fallen hill forts and the faded ink of monastic chronicles, and we have found not one man but an entire age staring back at us. The legend of King Arthur is a magnificent tapestry woven from many different threads. There is the thread of a Roman commander named Artorius, the thread of a high king like Riothamus who vanished across the sea, and the thread of countless unnamed warlords who fought to hold back the darkness. Each of these figures left a mark on the collective memory of the Britons, a memory that simmered for centuries in the cauldron of Welsh storytelling. The real historical trauma of the Saxon invasions, the desperate need for a unifying hero, and the lingering ghost of Roman order provided the raw material. The legend is the beautiful, polished artifact forged from that raw, historical metal. It is a story born from a profound and painful question: what happened to our world and who will lead us back to the light? The true power of Arthur, then, lies not in the unearthing of his bones, but in the immortality of his ideals. He embodies our timeless yearning for a just ruler, a code of honor that binds the powerful, and the fragile dream of a perfect society, a Camelot, however brief. His story endures because it speaks to the most fundamental parts of our own nature, the hope for a savior in dark times, and the tragic understanding that our greatest creations are often shattered by our own human flaws. We have not lost the historical Arthur, for he was never a single man to be lost. We have inherited something far greater, a story that belongs to all of us, a dream of a once and future king that continues to shape our world 1,000 years after his name was first whispered on the wind.